Good afternoon. This is Chris Diorio again for another edition of ChrisChat. I apologize to those of you who didn't get enough notice, but this is sort of a pop-up version of this relating to some questions that people have asked. And I know that this is something that has come up recently with the recent actions of the president. And people asking me and asking themselves, and I see the question out there a lot, both online and other sources, can he do this? You know, is this something that he can do? So getting a better understanding, I think, of what it is that the Constitution permits a president to do is, I think, essential for all of us in general to have an understanding as to what is allowed, what isn't allowed, what those authorities are. More importantly, today, for our purposes, what an executive order is. You know, there have been a great number of executive orders that have come out of the White House over the past 2 weeks, and I think it's important right now to have a sense as to what an executive order is, what its effect is, and how they're issued, why they're issued, where their authority comes to engage in these executive orders. First of all, what I want to get into is what are the president's powers? Where do they come from? You would think that this office that people spend millions and millions and millions of dollars every 4 years to run for this office, you would think that this is a tremendously powerful office imbued with great authority. But when you look specifically at what the constitutional authority of a president is, it is very skimpy. There's not a whole lot there. There's not a whole lot of meat on the constitutional bone as far as what the president's powers are. The president does have some very important powers, but certainly not as much as those granted to the legislature by the Constitution. If you have your copies of the Constitution, by all means take them out. Joke. But I encourage you to actually go look at what the Constitution says. The powers of the president are granted in the United States Constitution under Article 2. Article 2 of the Constitution deals with creating the executive branch and specifically discusses the presidency. And to look at it, you see that there are very few specific powers that are granted to the president. Section 1 of Article 2 addresses how the qualifications of a president, that they have to be 35, that they have to be natural born citizens, and you know that the term is 4 years. And then you get into what the actual enumerated powers are in sections 2 and 3 of Article 2. In brief, the president is the commander-in-chief of all United States armed forces and is empowered to commission all of the officers of the United States government, both militarily and otherwise. That power is granted. But technically, that power is shared with the Congress. While the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, in terms of sending military forces into armed conflicts, the Congress in Article 1, Section 8 has the power to create armies and has the power to declare war. So when the president sends people overseas without congressional authority, the risk is that Congress can basically call them back or cut off the money for things of that nature. So yes, the president does have commander-in-chief powers and can direct people overseas, but that power can be restricted in a sense by the Congress. The War Powers Act is one of those things from 1973 that presidents have basically been spitting on for the past 40 years, which says that if you send people overseas without our permission, you have to come back and report to us before we allow that incursion to continue to exist. So power number 1, the commander-in-chief power. Power number 2, appointing federal judges, including the Supreme Court justices, ambassadors, envoys, and governmental representatives, people from the United States that we're sending out to other countries. But that power is also restricted, as we saw for the past year or so with the fall and appointment of Merrick Garland by President Obama. that power to appoint federal judges is restricted by the advice and consent power of the Congress, specifically the Senate, in Article 2, Section 2. So if you appoint someone or nominate someone, their nomination has to go through Senate approval, and they have to be voted on. And it's not just the United States Supreme Court justices. As we talked about in a couple of ChrisChats previously, this power also addresses lower federal courts, and there are over 100 federal seats that are empty right now because judges were nominated for those seats and they were not given a hearing, or their nominations were not sent through, and so now there are all of these empty seats which can now be filled by a president who has a friendly Senate waiting for him. So the president has this power to appoint ambassadors, to appoint all of these people, to nominate them, but the Senate ultimately has to confirm them. So that's a power that the president has. It's enumerated, but it's restricted in a sense. The president has the power to grant clemency, to basically say you've served enough time in jail, now you can go home, or to pardon someone, to basically erase a blot from their criminal record, as if this never happened. We're pardoning you. The president can commute sentences and say that, you've served enough time, no more, it ends, which President Obama recently did with Chelsea Manning. The president can grant amnesties, as presidents have done regarding immigration, things of that nature, and basically granting an amnesty to folks who want to enter the country through a certain way. Reprieves for convictions for any federal crimes, they can go do that. Any federal crime except impeachment, by the way. So Commander-in-Chief, appoint justices, granting clemency and pardons. Clemency and pardons are not restricted. The president can do as they wish. The president has the power to receive foreign ambassadors and can approve their qualifications. The president has the power to veto legislation. Each bill passes through both houses, in the Congress, and then goes on to the president. And the president, there's no specific veto power that's stated, but it says that the president has the power to approve legislation or to not act upon it, what we know as the pocket veto. They have 10 days to do something. If they don't do it, it's considered vetoed. The president has the power to impound the budget. The president can make appointments of federal officers and officials. The president has the power to negotiate treaties. All of these things are in Article 2, Section 2, and Section 3. The president can negotiate treaties, but again, these treaties have to be approved by the Congress. So all of these powers that the president has enumerated to him, by and large, most of them are to be executed hand in hand with the legislature. So that the government is working together, if possible, on all of these things, but also providing checks and balance, as we talked about with the commander-in-chief power. The president can send folks overseas, but Congress technically has to be consulted. The president can propose legislation to Congress, but he can't do anything about it. Congress is the one that has to legislate. And that is where you get into the question regarding executive orders. What is it that the president can do? Because the president is not, as an executive, empowered to make the law. That's not permitted. So what are executive orders? And where do they come from? Well, they're not in any of those enumerated powers. I went through a list of about 10 or 11 different powers that the president has, but none of them are necessary. Executive orders are not something that's specifically stated. I wrote a couple of days ago about penumbral rights and things that come from necessarily out of other established rights. We have a right to privacy because we have a Fourth Amendment right to be free of search and seizure. We have a Fifth Amendment right to silence. We have due process rights to be secure in our homes. All of those things create what we know as a right to privacy. But there is no specific grant of power for executive orders. Executive orders are something that's existed since George Washington, and they've basically been cobbled together out of other statements in the Constitution. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 1 vests in the president the executive power. Article 2, Section 3 says that the president has to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's one of those statements that then has been used to say, well, this gives me the power to address things that are under the executive branch. It doesn't have a specific definition. It does lack a specific definition, but this executive power gives the president broad enforcement authority to use discretion to determine how the law is going to be enforced. That's what the executive authority does. There's a legal basis in this by Congress granting certain authority to administrative and executive agencies to enforce the law, such as the INS, such as ICE, such as the EPA, such as the Department of Justice. All of these different things, these areas are monitored by the executive branch, and as such, as the head of the executive branch, he has the power to render orders to make people do things. With the exception of one president, it was President Harrison, if I'm not mistaken, who died a month after being sworn in, every single president has issued executive orders. George Washington, as I said, was the first one. Thomas Jefferson authorized the Louisiana Purchase by executive order. We don't have the Louisiana Purchase without an executive order. President Polk authorized the annexation of Texas. Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It's an executive order. It's not a law. Congress didn't do it. The president said it and made an executive order, and we have, or at the time had, the Emancipation Proclamation. John Kennedy created the Peace Corps by means of an executive order. That was not legislation. One of the sad things that we did by means of executive order, FDR, during World War II, ordered the internment of Japanese Americans by means of executive order. All of these the executive orders, this is not something new. These things are not new. President Obama issued a great number of executive orders, 276, but certainly not as many as his predecessors. Franklin Roosevelt, because he was operating during the Depression, holds the record. I believe it's upwards of 3,000 executive orders from FDR. George W. Bush had 291 orders. Bill Clinton had 360 plus different orders. So this is not something new. The power of the executive order is not new. What is new, however, is the tremendous gridlock in Congress that has resulted in presidents feeling that it is necessary because legislation cannot get through. They then utilize this executive order power to make things happen. So that's why we see more of it. People criticize executive orders, and a lot of criticism now over the executive orders that have come out. The Muslim ban, so-called, was an executive order. Restricting the Affordable Care Act and weakening the Affordable Care Act was an executive order. These are the list that people are jumping up and down about. People criticize executive orders. They're basically ways, they're end runs or ways to circumvent congressional approval. They're ways to circumvent the separation of powers that is built in to the Constitution through the first three articles. But this is a major part of federal executive authority, and it is unlikely at any point to disappear. But, and this is what's important to look at in terms of executive orders, any order that the president grants or orders has to come from constitutional or legal authority. There has to be some limit. Presidents are not, they can't just simply say, make it so. There has to be some legal foundation for an executive order. There has to be some authority for them to do it. And this is where a lot of the legal investigation is taking place regarding the most recent executive orders. Is there some foundational authority that allows the president to do this? That's what has to be looked at. Moving forward, you have to look at all of these executive orders and make sure that they follow a specific process in terms of having the effect of law, and that's what executive orders do. Executive orders are basically statements to administrative or executive agencies that have been empowered to exercise the law or to enforce laws that have already been passed, and telling them what to do regarding that law. It's not new law in and of itself, but it is directing people in the manner of enforcement of, or lack of enforcement of, certain laws that have already been placed on the books. In looking at the executive orders that have been thrown out of the White House already, a great deal of them, in terms of their actual content, are pretty vague. They're kind of general in their statement, and they don't really do anything. They're almost like shouting into the wind. The first executive order that he signed almost before the horses cooled down from the inaugural parade. The first executive order existed relating to the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, for those who aren't aware, and there are people out there who aren't aware that it's the same thing. It didn't really order anybody to do anything. It was just a statement. The executive order on the Mexican wall is vague. There's nothing there. It doesn't really command anything. If you want to equate them to something else, think of executive orders, at least the ones that we've seen most recently, as press releases. It's really all they are, until Congress does something, or until an administrative agency actually does something, which is what happened with the Muslim ban. And that's where it starts to get dangerous, when people start to step in and do something. That's when it's a problem. So now you've got, look at specifically what the most recent one relating to the Muslim ban. How does he have? Where does the authority come from? The argument from the White House is that there is a congressional law called the Immigration and Nationality Act that is a general regulation for immigration into the United States. What the White House is saying related to his executive order is that his authority to execute and to enforce that law permits him to take any additional incremental steps that are necessary to enforce that law, up to, apparently, in his mind, including shutting the doors to the country to certain nationalities who happen to have their national origin in countries that are predominantly Muslim in nature. It can be rampantly abused. There are things that have been done by executive order that are great things for the country, and yet there are others that are not. Again, what the president has in terms of how their authority comes, usually they'll say that because they are ordered to faithfully execute, as it says when they raise their right hand to God, you faithfully execute the laws, and you have to enforce them. So they have this general duty to ensure that the laws of the nation are faithfully executed. So when he issues this Muslim ban, he says, I'm noting my obligation to protect the American people from terrorist attacks. It's not clear necessarily as to how this order does that, but leave that aside. So how do you get away with these things? Like I said, it's not new. It's not, policymaking by executive order is not new. It's not a new invention. George Washington did it. The first day he was in office, he allowed for the Articles of Confederation to be erased in favor of the new Constitution. So you can do these things. But whatever you think about the propriety of them, you now have to look at what authority do you have. And again, as I say always, if there are questions that you have, by all means pop in and I'll try to answer them either live or later on when I stop jabbering. So if you have an executive order, you first have to look at what is the legal authority that grants the president this power to do this. And if there is none, or if it is specious or questionable or vague, now you have to ask yourself, what can be done about an executive order? Well, two things really. Two things right off the bat. One, an executive order has to, as I've said, rest on authority delegated to the president by the legislature, or through means of an executive decree or an administrative agency or something of that nature. The easiest way is for Congress to slap them right back. I mean, if the president says something and Congress doesn't like it, they can do something legislatively to eliminate the executive order or the authority of it. Pass a law that nullifies the executive order, rather than, clarifying that the president's delegated powers don't in fact include whatever foolish thing that they're doing. But right now, given the current construction or composition of both the White House and the legislature, it may not necessarily be likely that Congress is going to act proactively to stop or stifle any of these most recent executive orders. The president cited a constitutional obligation for the basis of the most recent orders. Congress can't get rid of those powers in Article 2. They're there. Secondly, you've got both houses, the Senate and the House, in Congress being led by a majority party that is in favor of the president. Both Senator McConnell and the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, are both sort of sitting and waiting as these things go. And they're going to let these things happen. So what is the other avenue? One of the questions that I have was, what avenue do we have for executive orders related to one of the other branches of the government? Who stops these things? The same people that stopped them the other day. On Friday, the Muslim ban gets signed, and on Saturday evening at 9:53, a federal district court says no. The place where most of these executive orders are going to have to be addressed is in the courts. Until we have a balance in more of a balance in the legislature, or some ability to fight back regarding executive orders. And this is all presidencies. I'm just dealing with what's in front of us right now. But the same rules apply. They applied to President Obama as well. They applied to President Clinton and President Bush before him. I'm just discussing what the process is. But right now, the courts is where you go. Executive orders carry the effect or the force of law, but they are not in fact law themselves. But because they have the effect of law, they are subject to judicial review, as they found out the other night. You have to look at what the court is going to do, and whether the courts are going to look at an executive order and say this particular order lacks constitutional authority. People like the ACLU and other individuals or organizations going into courts and saying, we need to strike down this executive order because it's unconstitutional. It has no basis in legislative or executive authority. That's the remedy. The courts, lower levels and above, can prohibit the enforcement of the order. They can strike the order down altogether. This is why and this is why it's so important right now. When you look at the courts issuing executive orders and federal executive agencies like the Customs Division, like Border Patrol agents, still refusing to let people in, refusing to let people that are being detained have access to counsel, despite court orders that require them to do so. This is a real potential for a constitutional crisis, because you have an executive branch that is charged with enforcing the law, and the courts, when they issue an edict like this, it is law. And then you have the executive branch that's supposed to enforce it saying, no, we don't like it. And now you've thrown the system of checks and balances completely out of whack. If the executive branch can look at something and say, I don't care what the court says, we're out. We'll do what we want. They're violating it. Technically, they're in contempt. And contempt of a federal court order is potentially a crime. It is, if some might go this route, a high crime or misdemeanor, or a violation of presidential authority, which then leads us to, potentially, an impeachable offense. So if the executive branch is going to continue down the road of ignoring federal orders, then perhaps all of these folks who have said, what do we have to do to make it happen? How can we get this guy out? Well, that might be it. It might be these types of orders that completely fly in the, A, orders that fly in the face of constitutional authority, and B, once courts have slapped back and said, no, this order is unconstitutional, then he refuses to enforce or operate under what the court says. Now you've got a real fight on your hands. And then this is where we break down. This is where we look at how this system is going to continue to work if we have an executive branch that refuses to abide by lawful orders given. That's all I have. If you have any specific questions, I'll sit here for a while and answer them if they come up. But hopefully I've addressed the questions that were posed to us, and this is an area of great importance right now. What is incumbent upon all of us, as I will continue to say, and I've said before, and I'll continue to repeat, be educated. Go read your Constitution. It's not that hard. It's really not that hard. The Constitution is right there for you. You can get it on your phone. If you get one thing out of today, if you get one thing out of anything that I discussed with you here ever, go today, go to your app store, go to the Google store, go the Android, whatever, go there and download onto your phone a copy of the United States Constitution with the amendments attached. Do that. And every now and again, read it. Find out what people can do and what they can't, because it's not just the executive branch that can engage in overreach, which is what a lot of people are talking about now with these executive orders, that he's acting above and beyond his authority. What you also have to look at is legislative overreach. What can Congress do? Are they extending themselves beyond what they're empowered to do? Go look at that. Find out what they can do. Look at Article 1, Section 8. Read that, because that tells you what powers Congress has. Go read Article 2. Find out what's going on, what the president can do. It's right there. All of these things are right here for you to read. Go read them. And then if you have questions about them and what they mean, I'm here. There are other people out there that you can ask, and I'll be happy to give you an opinion on it, and hopefully it's educated. I trust that it is. But go find it and read it for yourself. You shouldn't ever be without this. This is the law that creates us. This is the law that binds us together. And we all should know what it is and have access to it. Walk around with it. Have it in your pocket. Do that. And then when things like this come up, go look and find out. One question here, exactly how far beyond the law has the executive branch gone? Again, like I said, in terms of the executive orders that have been come down right now, most of the answers, one thing that you have to do when you write up an executive order, you have to state in the order what your authority is. So you do that, and it will usually say, if it's vague, they'll say, because I'm operating under my Article 2 authority to lawfully and faithfully execute the Constitution of the United States, and that's it. But as I said previously, if you look at the executive orders that have already been passed, or passed through the president's office, most of them are extremely vague and extremely general, and they don't really do anything. The ACA order was just shouting into the wind. I want you to do this. The executive order on the Mexican wall was just we plan on doing this in the future, and I want the Congress to do this. Well, fine. You could issue, as I said previously, you can issue a press release to do all of that. But instead, you make it an executive order, and that sort of has legal authority. But it doesn't really tell people what to do. The most dangerous one thus far has been the Muslim ban. And I'll continue to use the term because that really is what it is. I don't see any, there are no Christians being held at the gates. It's specifically designed to go after Muslim majority, well, some Muslim majority countries, but other Muslim majority countries are flying under the radar for whatever reason. You can make your own political statement about that. But these executive orders are legally binding, but they don't really say anything. So right now, if you're asking me how far beyond their powers they've gone, that's going to be for the courts to decide. And as we learned last week, the courts felt that this particular order regarding the Immigration and Nationality Act was at least temporarily deemed to be unconstitutional. So we'll wait. And those orders all said that there would be there had to be new complaints filed at the beginning of the week. So I have not yet seen any new complaints that have been filed. But for right now, the issue is not that the order itself has been deemed unconstitutional. The problem is that there's a court order out there that says that they are, and the executive branch and their administrative agencies are not following it, which then goes deeper into problems we have with enforcement. And as folks have opined previously, and as I've discussed here further, when the persons or agencies that are charged with enforcing the law violate it themselves, then we are down a road towards anarchy. If the people who are not going to enforce the law, who are charged to enforce the law, break it openly, then why should anybody obey the law? And that's, it can't get any more serious than that. Question here, do you see in the future the courts becoming politically gridlocked like Congress? Absolutely. And we're going to see that as more and more justices are appointed to lower federal courts, either at the district level or at the appellate level. But that's what the Supreme Court is for, is to address those gridlocks. Usually the Supreme Court will not jump into a case or make a decision until circuit courts are in opposition to each other. When you see that the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which has traditionally been a much more conservative court, decides on a constitutional issue in one way, and then you've got the First or Second Court of Appeals up here in the Northeast, which are decidedly more liberal courts in a sense, deciding on a constitutional issue in another way, at that point the Supreme Court has to step in and make a decision. So yes, there is gridlock, and it's existed for quite a while, and this is why we have one court at the top that says what the law is. John Marshall in Marbury versus Madison very plainly said that our job is to interpret what the Constitution says. And so from that point, those 9, soon to be 9 again, will have that decision-making power as they've had since 1803 to look at the different interpretations from lower courts and say this, in fact, is what the Constitution says regarding and what it means regarding this particular area of law. As folks have talked about, and again, I'll repeat myself again, the Supreme Court is not the final court because they're right, but they are right because they are final. They have the final say. There is nobody above the United States Supreme Court unless you look to a higher court. But right here, right now, in this country, the United States Supreme Court is the last voice in this. So I think I've exhausted my time. I tend to go on and on with these things, and I can talk about them for a long time, but I lose a lot of people over the course of time, so I'm trying to restrict these as close as I can to half an hour, unless it's a really, really important topic like this one, so I've gone a little bit over time. Thank you very much for those of you who watched and who stayed with me throughout. I will continue to go forward with more ChrisChats, and if you have suggestions, by all means, send them along. But for now, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again. And you can join me for another Chris Chat.